Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for turning out. It's a real pleasure to welcome Gareth Jenkins back to the ISS. Gareth has had a long-standing association with the Institute. I guess it must go back over sort of 15, 16 plus years. And I certainly remember that when I arrived at the Institute, one of the adelphies that everybody was talking about was on the role of the military in Turkish politics, a Adelphi book in 2001. And in the years that followed, Gareth also produced a very scholarly assessment of political Islam in Turkey as well. So I think both of those themes are going to maybe feature in the conversation that we'll have today. And I know from past experience that by the end of this hour, we'll all know a lot more about Turkey and understand it better than we do now. The challenge I guess we have is one of an embarrassment of riches. Where do you start and where do you end with Turkey at the moment? We've got the question of Turkey's domestic political trajectory. We're now post-coup, but pre-constitutional referendum in April. Where is Erdogan taking the country, and what does that mean in terms of domestic political stability and continuity? Turkey clearly lives in a very tough neighborhood. There is the question of the conflict in Syria. There are the questions around counter-terrorism that arise from that as well. But it's also a region in which there are rather large players looking to assert their interests in very stringent ways, from Iran to Saudi Arabia and others. And then there's the wider world. I think the question of the migration issue has demonstrated the degree to which Turkey is an important relationship with Europe, has an important relationship with Europe, but also has demonstrated how complicated and tricky that relationship can be. And then I suppose there's another set of questions that we might get into concerning how these domestic political trajectories in Turkey and how some of Turkey's foreign policy instincts are really reconcilable with, congruent with comparative instances among other members of the NATO alliance, of which Turkey is a prominent member. So Gareth is going to talk to us for about 25 minutes or so. It's all on the record, and then there'll be questions and comments, I hope, from all of you. So Gareth, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to try really to give a brief overview. I always start off with these things thinking I'll be able to talk for less, and I get bogged down in details, end up talking for more. But I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions, and to get into kind of more specific issues in more detail, it's probably better to leave that to the Q&A session. So I'll give a rough overview first, and then we'll get into the questions. I've been living in Turkey since 1989. I've never been so concerned about the country as I am now. I wasn't in Turkey during the 1970s, so I can't say this is the deepest crisis in 50 years or something, but it's certainly the deepest political crisis in the time that I've been there. We have President Erdogan becoming increasingly autocratic. We have the effective collapse of the rule of law in Turkey. We have lots of purges. Around 140,000 civil servants have been either dismissed or suspended. The last figure I saw, it may be a little bit higher now, but the last official figure I saw was 809 companies have been seized, with total assets of over $10 billion. We've had a lot of people put in prison. We've had a lot of those people having their total assets confiscated, including journalists who have not yet been convicted of any crime, have had their houses, their cars, their bank savings, everything confiscated. So this is very disturbing in itself. Against this, you have a background of a slowing economy in general. If you talk to anybody in the Turkish business community, they'll discuss with you how deep they think the coming crisis is going to be, how they think their company is going to survive it, but nobody will say the economy is getting better. We have, of course, also a lot of terrorist attacks from the PKK, and also from all these different acronyms for this organization, for Daesh, ISIS, whatever you want to call them. Extraordinary social alienation in the Kurdish part of the country, the southeast. I've been travelling there almost since I arrived in Turkey. I've never seen alienation at this level, even though the violence was a lot worse in the early 1990s. You've got widespread fear in Turkish society. It's often referred to in international media as being a polarised society, but there are more than two polarities. I mean, it's a deeply fragmented society. Of course, Erdogan's opponents are frightened of Erdogan. Erdogan's supporters are frightened of the foreign conspiracies he keeps maintaining, trying to undermine the country. And quite a few people, even amongst his opponents, are frightened of both Erdogan and the foreign conspiracies. And so we have this danger of, I think, very major damage to the fabric of Turkish society, as well as to politics and to the economy. As Adam said, we've got some constitutional amendments being put to a referendum on the 16th of April. These will really kind of, I think, formalise what's already Erdogan's domination of Turkish politics. We have an executive presidency, the abolition of the prime ministry. Erdogan will choose the cabinet ministers, also has the power to choose some vice presidents, can be from inside or outside parliament. He will be able to be a member of a political party. At the moment, he appoints just under, around about 45% of the top judges in the country. This will go up to nearly 70% under this system. He already has de facto control of the judicial system, but this will give an even tighter de jure control over it as well. The Parliament will maintain the ability to pass legislation, which will then be sent to Erdogan for his approval, but Erdogan will be able to pass legislation in his own right. Erdogan will also prepare the state budget. There are a lot of other changes as well. Perhaps the most significant thing is what is not there, and that's any system of checks and balances. So you have all power concentrated in one person without any system of trying to control this. Most of these changes will come in on the 3rd, after simultaneous presidential and parliamentary elections on the 3rd of November 2019. Some of the changes, like I mentioned, the president being able to be a member of a political party and increased power to appoint the top judges, that will come in immediately. Quite why Erdogan's decided to wait so long, something I don't know. It does seem extraordinary to want to wait nearly 3 years to implement these changes. On the question of whether or not the changes are going to be passed in a referendum, again, I don't know. Opinion polls suggest that the electorate is fairly evenly divided at the moment. There are a lot of concerns that if it's still like that going into the second week of April, we may see some electoral fraud. It hasn't in the past been very widespread in Turkey, but we have seen instances in certain areas. Most notably with the March 2014 local elections, where it did occur in some cities. Certainly if Erdogan fails to get these changes, it will be a major blow for him. And it will, I think, be even more uncertainty and instability, even if he does get these changes. People try to be optimistic. It's very difficult to be optimistic about Turkey at the moment, regretfully. But people say, well, maybe once he's got this, he'll relax. I don't think that's going to happen. Partly because psychologically, and so much of Turkish politics now is about Erdogan's psychology. He's got locked into struggle, he's got locked into warning of foreign conspiracies everywhere, and if these changes are passed, then he's going to be looking ahead to the presidential election. Really, this is a gamble for very high stakes, because the presidential election, if nobody gets over 50% in the first round, then there's a runoff between the two candidates with the most votes in the first round. So there is a possibility, particularly if we continue to have this damage, I say, to the economy, generally in Turkish society, all the fear, there is a possibility that if there's a presidential election, Erdogan's popularity is a little bit down, goes to a runoff, everybody who doesn't like Erdogan could unite behind the other candidate. That's certainly a very big concern in the AK Party at the moment. But it's not a concern with Erdogan, who is very, very confident he's going to get all of these things. Is there anybody in politics who can stop him? No. You go back 10 years ago, particularly at the time when Adam mentioned I wrote my Adelphi paper. The Turkish military was then very powerful, of course too powerful for what we'd like to see in a democratic state. But it was, even though it was an undemocratic check, it was a check on the politicians. We don't have any such checks at the moment, and when the system's formalised, if the referendum passes, then the lack of any checks will also be formalised. The political opposition in Turkey has for a very long time been completely incompetent and unconvincing. The one party that did breathe a breath of fresh air into Turkish politics, the HDP, the pro-Kurdish party, even though some of its members, the Turkish authorities are right about this, some of its members are very close to the PKK. Many of these people have now been put in prison. The 59 MPs, 13 are currently in prison. One of the co-chairs, Figen Yüksekdağ, has just been stripped in the last 24 hours of a membership of parliament. The other co-chair, Selahattin Demirtas, is probably going to go the same way. And we don't have any other mechanisms or any other individuals. The business community cannot challenge Erdogan. There aren't any strong NGOs. Of course, he's got the media increasingly under his control. Very briefly, if you want, we can come back to this in the Q&A session. The coup of the 15th, 16th of July, who did it, I don't know. I can guarantee you that the government doesn't actually know anyway either. But they do believe very strongly as members of the Gülen movement. What we've seen over, 7 months since the coup took place, this narrative has been inculcated very, very aggressively to the point that nobody can ask questions about where is the evidence. Some of the trials have just started now. Earlier this week, in some of the testimonies given in court, the people who did actually try to stage a coup admitted that, but said we're not members of the Gülen movement. It is possible that some members of the Gülen movement were involved. Some other people were involved, some hardline secularists, some people in the military just didn't like Erdogan. But how all of this kind of meshed together is still very unclear. And it's symptomatic, really, I think, of a general problem in Turkey at the moment, is we can't even ask questions. Looking very briefly at security, as I said at the beginning, there are two main sources, really, of terrorist attacks in Turkey, the PKK and ISIS. Dealing with the PKK first, there was a dialogue with the government from 2013 to 2015. It's become commonplace, I've seen this a lot, to say that the PKK stopped that dialogue. PKK didn't stop the dialogue. Erdogan stopped the dialogue in March 2015, but the PKK restarted the violence in July 2015. The two are not actually the same thing. During that period when the dialogue was going on, and particularly when things began to blow up from the Kurdish perspective in northern Syria, the siege of Kobani, PKK actually wanted to keep that dialogue going. The YPG, the PYDs, the Syrian Kurdish organization, the YPG is a military wing of the PYD, and the skeleton, really certainly the command skeleton of the YPG, are nearly all PKK veterans. Very many of them are Syrian Kurds, because previously the PKK had a lot of Syrian Kurds fighting in its ranks. There are also some other elements from the HPG, there's always too many acronyms, there's always the military wing of the PKK also fighting on the ground in Syria. The deployment of the PKK's forces there meant that it didn't have so many forces to deploy in Turkey. It didn't really want to keep this, to go back to violence. But it has gone back to violence, and we've seen a shift as a result of its reduced resources in the HPG, its ability to deploy with its rural insurgency, guerrilla tactics. They've still been going on to a certain extent, but a lot higher reliance now on IEDs and BB-IEDs. One of the most disturbing changes for me is how many PKK suicide bombers we've started to have. We had a few in the late 1990s, but now we're getting a lot. Why is it disturbing? Because it's a symptom of the deep alienation amongst the Kurds. We expect these bombing campaigns to continue. Traditionally, the PKK has to pull back in its insurgency in rural areas during the winter months because of the snow. Snow will begin to melt towards the end of March, and we can expect the PKK to stage some attacks in rural areas just to demonstrate that they can. But I would imagine that going forward, IEDs mainly, in terms of personnel, they're low resource intensive. You put an IED on the side of the road, remote control detonation, you don't usually lose any fighters. So I expect we'll see then with the PKK a heavy reliance on IEDs, VBIEDs going forward. We'll probably also see some more attacks in the west of the country. It's quite extraordinary to go to the east now. Such is the control over the Turkish media that a lot of what's happening in the southeast doesn't get out at all. To give one example, from a few months ago when I went to try to get into the town of Şırnak in eastern Turkey, I'd heard there was a curfew imposed in March 2016. I hadn't heard anything more. I thought it must have been lifted. I went then in September 2016. It was still in place. 24-hour curfew for 6 months. 70% of that city had been flattened as a result of fighting between the PKK and the security forces. You don't see a lot of coverage of this in the Turkish media. Frustration at this from the PKK has resulted in the PKK carrying out attacks in the west of the country. You can suppress news of things that happen in the east. We have another big curfew, for example, at the moment in the town of Nusaybin. Lots of reports, impossible to confirm, of extrajudicial killings, torture, things like this. May be true, may not be true, but none of this is being covered in the mainstream Turkish media. So the PKK has been detonating bombs in the west of the country where nobody can really hide them. With ISIS, the Turkish government, ISIS of course they have a central command, but it's almost like a collection of warlords on the ground in Syria and Iraq. Turkey did have some contacts with some of those warlords going back a few years, but its main contacts with jihadists has been with other groups such as what used to be al-Nusra, it's what now Jabhat, was it Fatih al-Sham, and some of these other groups. Turkey had very close, and still does have very close relations with these groups. With ISIS itself, not so much. But it did allow them to operate very, very openly. You could go to the border, certainly up until mid-2015, and see ISIS and all the other groups collecting logistical supplies, organizing, recruiting, just sitting around sometimes in cafes, talking very, very openly. When Turkey began to clamp down, we had blowback from ISIS, and now, of course, Turkey is engaged at the moment in fighting around Al-Bab, along with some militia, rebel militia, and we've started to have, as Turkey's racketed up the pressure on ISIS, so we've had more bombings in Istanbul. We expect these bombings to continue. It's been a surprise, really, if you look at the number of intelligence reports of ISIS plans to attack and how many have actually been realized. The Turks, fair play, have caught a lot of them, but we fully expect some more to get through. One of the problems is that during this time when you had this laissez-faire policy by the Turkish government, ISIS was able to put down very deep roots amongst young radicalized Turks and Kurds. So it's going forward, the issue for Turkey is not just whether or not ISIS can be defeated in Syria and Iraq, it's what the repercussions will be of this, really not, of course, large in terms of a proportion of Turkey's 80 million population, but large in terms of security threat for these radicalized young people who could carry out attacks in their own name or could do it in the name of some other organization. So it doesn't look to be any prospect really of any let up there as well. I'm sorry, I'm not being very optimistic. Foreign relations, EU used to act as something of a constraint on Turkey. There was an awareness in the government circles that it needed relatively good relations with the EU, if only for economic reasons, because it's desperately short of FDI. A lot of investment also in the Turkish stock market, in the Turkish currency, and bonds and things like this. And there was an awareness in Ankara that it needed good relations, if it didn't have at least cordial relations with the EU, this could affect foreign investor confidence. That seems to have gone out of the window. We have, of course, the March 2016 refugee agreement. Turkey, I think, and Erdogan had put themselves in a bit of a spot, because previous to this agreement they were saying there's very little we can do. So many of these refugees are crossing the Aegean, going to the Greek islands. Actually, if you went to the coast at that time, these people were gathering very, very openly. There was a lot of the Turkish authorities could have done. The meeting places and the beaches they were mainly using for the inflatables were going across were very well known. But since that agreement, Turkey has clamped down, and so it's demonstrated that it cannot, of course, completely stop everybody, but it can certainly dramatically reduce the refugee numbers going across. In the last few months, there's been quite a big standoff between Turkey and the EU. Part of the deal was if everybody fulfilled their obligations, there would be a lifting of Schengen visa requirements for Turks, and Turkey was also promised what looks like a lot of money. Actually, if you look at the number of refugees in Turkey, it's not on a per capita basis, but it was promised quite a lot of money from the EU. Erdogan's been complaining about this. Another part of the deal was that the EU would accept some of the refugees. For every refugee that was returned from the Greek islands, the EU would take a refugee from one of the organised camps in Turkey. We don't know how many refugees there are in Turkey. The official figure is 2.8 million. 10% of those are in camps. Those 2.8 million are registered refugees. They're not unregistered if they escape to Europe, but at the same time there's a lot of unregistered refugees inside Turkey as well. But now that there's very few, under this agreement, very few refugees have been taken from the camps to the EU. Erdogan has several times threatened to bus a load of refugees to the Greek and Bulgarian borders. Sometimes they've also threatened to lift the restrictions, the gendarmerie and coast guard patrols, etc., to try to stop the traffic across the Aegean. My feeling is it's a bit of a bluff. Erdogan presents himself as being the representative of the world's Muslims. Nearly all of these refugees are Muslims. Would be very difficult for him to be, once having demonstrated he could, they could certainly dramatically reduce the flow if they remove those restraints, and we then have again thousands of people dying in the Aegean, and terrible conditions of, in the international media, of the refugees who would be stuck at the border because Greece and Bulgaria wouldn't let them in. That would be very damaging to Erdogan's perceived role as a representative of the world's Muslims. So I think it's a bluff. I don't think he's going to carry through on that threat. But he's certainly going to use it to attack the EU going forward. With the States, Turks had very high hopes of the Trump administration. We don't know exactly what Trump is going to do. Whether he's going to follow through on his very fierce rhetoric against Iran, what they're going to do in Syria, how much of Trump's plans he will be able to persuade the rest of the US apparatus to go along with. Of course, we already had some blowback from the judicial system. Some ideas will probably get some resistance from inside the US military. So at the moment, there's a lot of uncertainty. All I can really say is that Turks' very, very high expectations from Trump are going to be frustrated. One of the things that they wanted very much was for Trump to extradite Fethullah Gulen, who they believe is the mastermind of the coup. I don't think that's going to happen. So that will be a frustration in itself. And I would imagine there will also be frustration in Syria, because the US is probably not going to abandon the YPG completely, as Turkey is insisting. Just very briefly, looking ahead, and as I said, I'm going to be very pessimistic. Executive presidency, it happens. If it happens with the referendum, it's not going to bring Turkey stability. If it doesn't happen, it's not going to bring Turkey stability. Question marks still, even though his health is better than it was before, still question marks over Erdogan's health. There is no real designated successor. Much as I dislike the man, fair play to Erdogan, I've never seen anybody who can work a Turkish crowd in the way that Erdogan can. And there's nobody in the wings who can come forward and deliver his kind of raw, emotional, rhetoric that appeals to the Turkish masses. So even if Erdogan goes, there is nobody there to step into this vacuum. I think the international isolation is also going to continue, and one issue that, particularly in the West, people aren't really talking about is the Kurdish issue. As I said, I've never seen such deep alienation in Kurdish areas. Not all Kurds like the PKK, a lot of them dislike the PKK. There were a lot of Kurds who were supportive of the AK Party, but because of the news blackout, there are now no Hearts and Minds programs by the Turkish authorities. We have this estimated 500,000 people who've lost their homes as a result of the fighting. We have very severe economic hardship as a result of the fighting. And the kind of pro-PKK Kurds, of course, have always been antagonistic towards the government, but even the pro-AK Party, the pro-government Kurds, now feel abandoned. And I think going forward, that is going to be a very major issue and a very major challenge, either for Erdogan if he chooses to address it, or for who comes after him. Okay, I'll stop.
Well, thanks very much, Gareth. I think you've given us one or two things to reflect on in that presentation, in which you outlined really that your expectation is that there'll be a radical overhaul in how we understand the Turkish political system over the next few years, greater fragmentation in society, where a struggling economy is going to be brought in some ways more tightly into the grip of an executive presidency through the budgetary competences that will entail, whether entrenched security challenges stay entrenched or get worse, and where Turkey is being exposed to a regionally chaotic security environment that also doesn't seem to have any ready answers to it, and in which some of its fundamental relationships with Europe, with the US, seem to be unanchored, if I can put it that way. So we'll get into the Q&A and the comments now, but maybe I can just kick off by asking you, is what you've described simply the partly intended, partly accidental result of a series of impulses and instincts that emanate from Erdogan? Or do you think there is a kind of a strategy and a vision for the kind of country that he wants to construct that would also, by definition, outlast his own immediate executive presidency?
I think there's always been a vision, but I don't think he has a strategy. There's an expression in Turkey which was very widespread up until a few years ago, that you could be in office but not be in power because of the influence of the military. And during those early years when Erdogan was in power, he was very, very cautious. Since 2011, he's become increasingly self-confident, and he's also now surrounded himself by sycophants in his presidential palace outside Ankara, which means his view of the world is now extremely distorted. He certainly wants to see, and he said this publicly on many occasions, he wants to see Turkey become more explicitly pious. He wants to see it more identified with other Muslim countries rather than with the West. I don't think that necessarily means he's going to leave NATO. And he does have this vision, but we've always seen he's not a great intellectual, but he can be very clever in terms of seizing on opportunities. And I think what we look back over the last 4 or 5 years, though he has this broad vision of where he wants the country to be, and when he's seen an opportunity to push it a little bit closer, he's seized on that opportunity. But I don't think there's a blueprint sitting somewhere about how to do this. But just an example, there's a news come this morning that the Turkish military, once the bastion of secularism in Turkey, has announced that from now on, women officers will be able to wear the headscarf, and women who join the cadet level will also be able to wear the headscarf. This kind of thing, Erdogan's always wanted, but I don't think he ever, planned it in detail when to implement things.
Okay. We'll take some questions now, and if you catch my eye, for Gareth's benefit, could you just introduce yourself? Yes, please.
Fatih Göksu. I'm an independent researcher from University of Barcelona. Let's say 2-3 months later, presidential system has been implemented in Turkey, What you call this system is like authoritarian system, undemocratic system, dictatorial system. And if you call that, what is the difference between the presidential system in the USA and the Turkey?
I've always argued that what Erdogan actually wants is not a presidential system, it's an Erdogan system. And it's very sui generis. I mean, you do have presidential systems in other countries, yeah, and it's not a problem. I prefer a parliamentary system myself, but you have semi-presidential in France, you have the presidential system in the US. But what is different with what Erdogan's trying to do is this lack of any checks or balances. Erdogan is authoritarian now, and he's going to be even more so, I think, when this system comes. But it is going to be, in theory, it's going to be a presidential system. In practice, it's going to be an authoritarian presidential system.
Thank you. Yes, please, in the front.
Katerina Dallacura, LSE. Two questions. One about internal AKP politics. How are things developing within the AKP? I know that he has control over, of course, the majority of the party, but are there any rumblings of opposition? Is there any potential for a formation that will, if not unseat him, push him to a bit on the side? And the second question is about the prospect of a no vote in the referendum. What's going to happen in that circumstance if it was to happen? On the internal inside the AK party, there's a lot of discontent with Erdogan generally. Also discontent actually on the more conservative wing of the AK party. You talk to a lot of conservative Turks, both inside the AK party and outside. They're very disturbed, for example, by the corruption that's surrounding Erdogan now, and the language that he uses, very aggressive language they think clashes with their religious values. But everybody is terrified of Erdogan. It was summed up for me, it's still the case now, when early 2014, when Abdullah was getting ready to step down as president in August 2014, people in the AK party who were unhappy with Erdogan were going to Gül and say, look, you confront Gül as you confront Erdogan and we'll support you. And Gül will say, no, you confront Erdogan and I'll support you. Yeah. And it's still the same situation now, that these people who are unhappy are waiting for somebody else to be first over the parapet. But at the moment, they're very, very frightened of taking on Erdogan themselves. As I said at the beginning, there is also a lot of concern in the AK party about what happens if this system moves into somebody else's hands. And they know they'll be first on the firing line. So there's a lot of concern in that. But at the moment, there is no, also as I said, there's no kind of charismatic leader. There was some hope that Abdullah Gül would be brave enough to go and confront Erdogan. We haven't seen it yet. We may see if after the election, if there's a no vote. So the election, the referendum, if there's a no vote. But at the moment, there's a lot of unhappiness. But people are just terrified of this man. I mean, he's also a very difficult person to work with on a daily basis. If there's a no vote, we'll have early general election. I don't think there's any question about that. We have in the Turkish system, there's a 10% threshold for representation in Parliament. The last elections in November 2015, the HDP just scraped over. It will be very difficult for the HDP to get over again. The MHP are also in chaos, the Turkish Ultra-Nationalist Party, very, very divided amongst their grassroots. They'll also be divided in the referendum. Some will vote yes, some will vote no. The MHP could also struggle to get over the 10%. If you don't get over the 10%, then all the seats in Parliament, which at the moment would be 550, one of the changes is to raise them to 600, but that would still be 550 it's rejected. A huge number of those seats in the early general election will probably go to the AK party. So if the referendum fails, we're probably going to see an early general election and Erdogan trying to remain in power, remain his grip by other means, such as by getting a huge AK party majority in Parliament. Is that going to solve Turkey's problems? No, it's not. Particularly the Kurdish problem?
Particularly the Kurdish problem. There was a lot of discontent anyway in the PKK when there's this dialogue I mentioned from 2013 to 2015, which started at the end of 2012. But became public in 2013, because there had been two previous processes. And each time with the processes, the Turkish state would say, you announce a ceasefire and we'll consider your demands. And the PKK will bring in reams of suggestions for solutions to the table, most of them completely unrealistic. Nothing came back from the Turkish side. PKK announced a ceasefire, and these things ticked along. There was a lot of reluctance to go back to that third process, but they did go back to it. But they're unlikely to trust Erdogan again. And this is a major problem in the southeast as well. PKK is responsible for a lot of the violence in the southeast, no question. But at the same time, there's a lot of resentment in the southeast about the actions of the security forces. So it's going to be very difficult. If Erdogan goes, then we could have a return to a dialogue, yes. But we need Erdogan to go.
Desmond, please.
Desmond Byrne, double ILS member. A couple of things I'm trying to be grateful for your comment. First of all, the Gulenist, or rather Gulenism. I mean, what is it? I mean, Fethullah Gulen is the bogeyman, the conspirator, the author of the coup. But I mean, is there actually a vision and an idea that goes with Gulenism that is worthy of, as it were, the kind of treatment that they're getting? And I mean, I read absurd things like algebra books which feature F and G get banned, which sounds astonishing. And the second thing is, and this is kind of political scientist kind of stock question, given that Turkey was a kind of poster boy in a way for a Muslim country with the democratic principles. I mean, all the old ways of Turkey, and the bridge between East and West, and the key pillar of NATO, and standing out against Russia and all that sort of stuff, and not very strong leanings towards Europe, but nonetheless European aspirations. I mean, who lost Turkey, or how did Turkey get lost?
Okay. On the first one, Gulenism. It's one of the interesting things. Turkey hasn't really produced any great Islamic theologians ever. You talk to some of the radicals there, they all read Muslim Brotherhood literature. The non-radicals also tend to look more outside Turkey itself for intellectually cohesive theological writings. Gulen hasn't produced any great intellectual writings. He's very strong on emotion. His followers, if you watch their reaction to him, it's very much an emotional reaction. So once he goes, I think it's going to be very difficult, but the movement will survive for a time. But I don't think it's already diminishing in influence. But he's not living together, leaving behind a body of work which are able to perpetuate it. There is, of course, in Islam a kind of a strain of a messianic expectation, and I think many of Gulen's followers genuinely believe that Gulen has been touched in some way by God. But the way in which he's behaved, in which he's perceived, is very cultish. If you say this publicly, in the past when it was a little bit stronger, it would sue you. But I still think it's true. But it'll gradually, I think, fade away. There is discontent at the moment within the Gulen movement because so many of these people are being persecuted in Turkey are actually not Gulenists at all. We have leftists, we have secularists, a lot of other people. But the ones who are being treated the worst are Gulenists. And there's a lot of, well, not a lot, but certainly growing resentment amongst his followers that he's just sitting in Pennsylvania comfortable and he's not coming out and talking about these things. I met with somebody very high up in the movement a couple of months ago, and he was saying how when he meets with Gulen now talks about, the Prophet Muhammad suffered, so we have to suffer as well. And then his supporters say, that's all right, you don't have any kids, you're sitting in Pennsylvania. So I think some of that devotion is probably going to diminish. In terms of who lost Turkey, I think the West was extraordinarily naive about Erdogan. There's this almost, and the Western media as well as politicians, Erdogan is opposed to the military, yes. That doesn't in itself make you democratic. And I said at the beginning about this difference between being in office and being in power. I followed Erdogan since he was candidate for mayor of Istanbul. He actually elected in March 1994. And what I'm seeing now is no different to what I was hearing from him and his people back in the 1990s. He put it on hold because he wanted to get hold of power first. And I think a lot of people in the West were just extraordinarily naive. The EU probably above all. But the US, Erdogan's extraordinarily lucky with the timing when they came to power in November, or took office in November 2002. The Bush administration was desperately looking for somebody to hold up. So these are Muslims, these are our friends, they're Democrats, so Al-Qaeda is something completely different. So the timing of that was very, very lucky. But I think particularly the EU, but generally, not just the governments, media, everybody were very, very naive about it.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Gentleman here in front.
Güney Yıldız, journalist and Turkey and Kurds specialist. I have two questions, if I may. One is on the fragmentation. I totally agree with you that there are more polarities in Turkey. But do you think, and in this fragmentation, would you agree that the largest bloc is pro-Erdogan bloc, and the rest of the country is even more polarized? And countries fragmented on so many issues, but it is unified in a sense, especially the western countries, west of Turkey, on Kurdish issue, on stability. State is more important than even religion, I would argue, and on Gülenist as well. So this is the first question. Second one is you talked about the PKK's inability to deploy enough forces in Turkey to challenge the Turkish army. How would you think the Turkish army kind of performed in the recent round of talks? There's also a very heavy reliance on police and gendarmerie special forces, and very heavy reliance on air forces, which are not usually very effective. And if you compare it with their performance in Al-Bab, where also it took much longer than they predicted to take over.
Yeah. On your first question, absolutely, I agree. I mean, the devotion with which Erdogan's supporters regard him is very, very deep, and they're certainly also the largest of these the pieces in this mosaic, which is Turkish society. And it's a very major problem going forward. I mean, the size of them and the level of their devotion, and so many people in Turkey genuinely believe in the foreign conspiracy theories. I had a very rational friend of mine last week telling me that Britain was behind the coup, Queen was about to go to Ankara to apologise to Erdogan. And you hear that kind of completely crazy story, and people genuinely believe it. And that, in terms of the idea that the West is constantly conspiring to undermine Turkey, also extends beyond Erdogan's the key supporters. As you said, also on the Kurdish issue, this desperate need for stability at the moment, and a perceived need for stability. I think also that does cross the boundaries of these different fragments. And it's one of the reasons Erdogan is being able to get away with what he does. He's constantly saying we're under siege, we're under attack, etc., etc. So people are desperate for this. On the second issue, the competence of the Turkish military. Turkish military has lost a lot of people with the purges. It's lost nearly half of its generals and admirals. It's lost around about 10% of its commissioned officers. It doesn't have a great record on the battlefield. We have seen one change in the last few years against the PKK is the increased use of UAVs. It's been very effective in terms of identifying targets. Inside Syria, yes. I mean, I think Turkey still is struggling to take Al-Bab. We only know the casualties for the actual personnel who've been killed. We know that a lot of tanks have been destroyed because we can see that on the internet, but we don't know how many. And it's one of the interesting differences between ISIS and the PKK that the ISIS have been using these anti-tank guided missiles, which the PKK doesn't have. And they've been taking out a lot of tanks, and this has really exposed some of the shortcomings of the Turkish military. Morale in the Turkish military is also very low, and I've been struck with the battle in Al-Bab when the Russians hit a house containing some Turkish soldiers a week or so ago. The wounded were then taken out by road to the Turkish border and then helicoptered from Kilis on the border to Gaziantep hospital. The Turkish military is still afraid of flying helicopters inside Syria. It's also a little bit frightened of flying helicopters against the PKK because it's worried it's getting more manpower to take them down. But at the moment, I say the PKK's resources and ability to deploy kind of classical rural guerrilla warfare have been diminished. So the military doesn't have to worry as much. One striking thing in the southeast is how over the last couple of years so much of the fight against the PKK is now being carried out by police paramilitaries, what are called the special teams, and also usually in English translated as riot police, but something like flexible forces would be a more accurate translation. Travelling in the southeast, up until 4 or 5 years ago, all the roadblocks would be manned by regular military or gendarmerie. Now they're nearly all manned by police. And same in the cities, nearly all of these operations are being led by the police. I was in Diyarbakir sort of this time last year when there was fighting and watching the forces going in. They were nearly all police paramilitaries, a little bit of backing from the regular military. Why does this matter? Because the police are a lot closer to Erdogan than the military. So we're having this increasingly politicized struggle. But yeah, so we'll see, going forward, whether the military is able to deal. One of the problems with the counter-terrorism, again, the police, the intelligence service, not so much, but the police have also lost a lot of their intelligence officers in these purges. So we have diminished capabilities on that side as well. As I said, actually, so far they've done very well. We've only had the number of attacks that we've had. Could have been much worse. It's bad enough.
Okay, I want to fit in 4 questions in the 10 minutes remaining, so we'll take them in batches of 2, if that's okay. First of all, you, sir, third row. Yep, yes.
Hello, Clive Newell from G3. We're a political risk and business intelligence consultancy in London. I was previously in the diplomatic service in Ankara in summer of '94 when Erdogan was doing so well in Istanbul. And my question is a business-related question. What should we be telling investors, would-be investors, into Turkey? We've seen the recent BAE Systems deal, of course. I wouldn't expect to see many deals on that scale, but I'm hoping that we can tell people that life goes on and they could still be investing in Turkey.
Thank you.
Yeah, pardon me, Bruce George, former Member of Parliament, Labour, not now, I tell you. It's such a depressing talk. It's brilliant, but it's so bloody depressing. And the fact that this guy is close to the European Union makes me puke. Is there anything that could happen, not illegally, to get rid of this bastard? Because if anybody needs to get rid of, he, from what I've heard, should be got rid of. But there haven't been any coups that have been successful. Can't the West do more than they're doing? It appears they're not doing bloody anything to let this terrible, terrible man rule this pathetic country. Is there any hope that he'll die?
All right, I'm not sure any of this really corresponds to our ISS parliamentary standards of language. So I think we take on board the sense of your message.
I'll deal with this first. His health isn't great. It's better than it was a few years ago. He had intestinal cancer. He's also got some other medical complaints. The expectation a few years ago when he had several operations was that the cancer was going to come back and come back quite quickly. It hasn't come back. He's under constant supervision. We've got a special medical unit in the palace. So we don't know how long his health is going to hold out. I would be surprised, I'm not saying I'm wishing for this, but I'm surprised if he can keep going for another 13 years. I mean, if these changes are passed, it'll allow the president to serve 2 5-year terms. So that would be 2 5-year terms from November 2019. But it's almost another 13 years. I don't think his health can hold out that long. Just what you just have to look at American presidents, how they look when they take office and how they look when they come out of office. It's extraordinarily exhausting, and particularly for such an authoritarian person who's trying to control everything. So I think his health could be an issue. Not necessarily he's going to die, but it might make him incapable of continuing. In terms of what the West can do, can stand up a little bit more, I think, a little bit more publicly to criticise what's happening in terms of the rule of law. It comes also to what was the first question I'll come to in a moment. Some of these people have had, as I said earlier, who haven't been convicted, have had all of their assets confiscated. We've had torture of the people who were allegedly involved in the coup. We have massive repression of freedom of speech, and I've lost count of the number of people I know who are now in prison. And the Europeans in particular are frightened of speaking out against Erdogan in case he abrogates the refugee deal. And I said before, I think that his threats are something of a bluff, because he wants to be portrayed as a protector and everything over the world's Muslims. So it could certainly be more vocal in the criticism. One thing about Erdogan is he thinks he can get away with almost anything, and he has been getting away with almost anything. So some more vocal criticism. For the businesses, Turkey's got a great potential. I've been there since 1989. There hasn't been a year when I haven't written something about Turkey's potential economically. But because at the moment the political situation is so unstable, there's so much uncertainty, we expect the economy to get worse before it gets better. From a very cynical perspective of somebody looking to buy something in Turkey and to start up a joint venture, actually your price may go down because of this. Certainly are going to be a lot more attractive investment opportunities in the future as the economy struggles. Hearing a lot from businesses in the last few months about how they wish they had a foreign partner. But the situation is so unstable, it'd probably be worth holding off for a time and hoping that things stabilise. But the potential is still there. It's got a great potential.
Is it conceivable that there would be a no vote in the referendum that would be a factor?
It's possible. The polls at the moment, I was saying, are showing a fairly even split. Some of the polls are all over the place, but approximately 40, low 40s saying yes, low 40s saying no, and then the remainder undecided. And those undecided are probably going to decide it. But
sounds familiar.
Yes. We do also worry about electoral fraud. But it is a possibility that there will be a no vote, yes.
Yes.
Skander Keynes from House of Commons. Wanted to follow up on your point a second ago when you said you thought the West, the European Union, the UK should also potentially be a bit stronger on some of the negative trends they're seeing. I was wondering if, in particular in the context of the constitutional referendum and about sort of balancing UK policy ahead of that, because on the one side of the argument might say Turkish democratic event, any society may perceived sense that the UK is interfering, it could fuel conspiracy theories. On the other hand, in Parliament particularly, NGOs and journalists and people have been coming in and sort of lobbying, saying they want the UK to actually get involved in the fight, and that we should be coming down on one side of the argument. I wonder what you think about that.
And then you still have the final question.
Andrew Barlow, member of the Institute. No, I just wondered if you could say something about Turkish-Russian relations.
Okay. On whether the UK certainly, I mean, particularly the way things are going with the UK's own membership, or soon to be lack of the EU. And we saw Theresa May go to see Erdogan at the time when, unless they really had to, other Western leaders weren't going. Merkel has gone a few times because she feels she has to. It does mean I think Erdogan is a little bit less hostile towards the UK than he is to some of the other countries. Certainly less hostile than he is towards Germany, as he sees the UK as moving away from the EU. And the UK has traditionally been quite supportive of Turkey inside the EU. So there's a certain amount of leverage there, I think. But the issues that the UK should be speaking out against are the same as the issues everybody else should be speaking out about. Human rights, freedom of expression, and the rule of law. This is something which is unprecedented. I've never seen this in Turkey before. I mentioned about people having their assets confiscated without a court decision. I've never seen that before. That kind of thing really should be getting a lot more publicity. So the UK can certainly try, but it shouldn't be alone. On Russia, Turkey used to have a highly compartmentalized relationship, flourishing economic ties, agree to disagree on some issues, quite hostile on others, particularly, of course, Syria. We had this downturn after the Turks shot down the Russian Su-24 on 24th of November 2015. And then Putin began to cozy up to Erdogan again in June last year. Not coincidentally, just before there was a big NATO summit in Warsaw. So he was very clearly trying to establish close relations with a member of NATO at the same time as most of NATO regarded Putin as a pariah, to chip away at NATO unity. A lot will depend, I think, on what happens with Putin and Trump. If they have a slightly less hostile relationship than Obama did with Putin, Putin will probably think he doesn't need Turkey as much as he would if under Obama. Even though there is this apparent rapprochement, the Russians still haven't lifted most of the economic sanctions they imposed on Turkey after the shooting down of the plane, and they seem to be constraining Turkey's movements inside Syria. It really is a black box. It's very difficult for me to get a lot of information about what's happening in Syria. And strikingly for me, the Russians have been quite pro-Kurdish. PKK is classed as a terrorist organization in Europe, in the States. It's not in Russia. PYD has an office in Moscow. 15th of February, the Russians hosted a big Kurdish conference in Moscow. Why 15th of February? Why is that important? Because it's the anniversary of Abdullah Öcalan's capture, the ideological mastermind, to use a phrase, behind the PYD and the PKK. So it's a very clear message, certainly interpreted by the Kurds as a message of support from Moscow, and the Russians aren't stupid. I'm sure they knew that's how it was going to be interpreted. So you have this highly complex relationship at the moment, and in the longer term, Russia is going to want Assad or somebody like Assad in power in Syria. It certainly wants to continue its military presence in Syria, and that's going to put it at loggerheads with Turkey. If the Turkish operation in Al-Bab is successful, Turks are talking about going on to Manbij, going on to Raqqa. It's not going to happen, particularly Raqqa is not going to happen. The Turks will probably have to start pulling back from Syria under pressure for the Russians. So we could see some more tensions getting back into the relationship, but I wouldn't be surprised if they somehow managed to compartmentalize the relationship that they did in the past. Russia is Turkey's biggest supplier of natural gas, one of its biggest suppliers of oil. It's also building Turkey's first ever nuclear power plant. And we started to see, not on the same level as before, started to see Russian tourists come back. So we may go back to this kind of compartmentalized relationship, rather than it being, friends in all areas or enemies in all areas.
Gary, thanks so much indeed. I can tell simply from whizzing of pens, making notes, and people's fingers typing on various devices that we need to make sure we get you back here more often than we have in the recent years. But thanks very much for a presentation. I think tour de force would be the appropriate term for. Please join me in thanking Gary.